January 27th, 1945. Beuthen, Upper Silesia. The first sound that reached Leah Rosenfeld was not a scream or a gunshot, but the sharp snap of a tool opening behind her, in the dim half-light of a freight car soaked with the smell of old iron, frozen urine, and accumulated fear. The handcuffs had been burning into her wrists for 17 hours. The skin was split and inflamed, and every smallest movement required a bargain with pain, because the metal had bitten so deeply that she could no longer tell where the iron ended and her own blood began. Leah did not lift her head. No one did. In that place, looking was dangerous. Looking meant being seen, and being seen meant being chosen. Then a German voice cut through the frozen air. Cut them, and the word fell heavy, like a sentence already decided. Miriam Katz was the first to break. She didn't scream or beg. She let out a low, almost animal sound, as if her body had understood the true meaning of the order before her mind did. Beside her, Hannah Weiss pressed her lips together until they turned white and tried to shield her with her own body, as if it were still possible to protect someone with exhausted flesh, as if bodies still existed for something other than obedience. They didn't think of freedom. They thought of mutilation. They had heard too many stories. Hands smashed by rifle butts, bones broken during inspections, punishments disguised as procedures, fingers severed to teach obedience, wrists split open by accident while removing chains. These weren't rumors. They were testimonies from women who returned from infirmaries with fewer fingers than they had when they went in. Women who had learned that cut them didn't always mean metal. The soldier who gave the order didn't shout or insult. Otto Keller spoke quietly, and that was what terrified Leah most, because when soldiers whispered, something irreversible usually followed. Shouting was predictable. Silence was not. The tools moved closer, metal against metal, and the sound of the cutters opening echoed through the car like jaws ready to bite. Someone began to pray under their breath, Yiddish words mixing with the vapor of frozen breath. Someone fainted before seeing anything, her body collapsing forward, held up only by the handcuffs linking her to the others. Eva Silber squeezed her eyes shut, clenching her teeth until her jaw hurt, as if something might break inside her mouth before her spirit did. Leah closed her eyes when the cold steel touched the chain between her wrists. Her body tensed, bracing for the pain she had been promised for months, the pain she had seen in other eyes, heard in the night screams of the barracks, the pain no one ever forgot. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a different sound, a clean, final crack, a weight disappearing, something falling onto the wooden floor with an almost absurdly light clink. Leah opened her eyes. Her hands were still there, intact and free. Her fingers still moved. Blood still flowed. The metal lay on the floor. Her skin remained. Then the women began to cry, all at once. Not out of fear, but because no one had taught them how to react when the enemy failed to deliver the promised cruelty. Because in the middle of absolute horror, someone had chosen to disobey. And that small, silent gesture shattered something they had buried so deep they thought it was gone, something dangerously close to hope. 43 Jewish women felt their handcuffs fall that January morning. 43 women who had stopped counting days, and who for one impossible moment stopped being numbers and became bodies again. Bodies with names, with stories, with aching wrists that were still their own. January 1945 was not the worst month of the war. It was something else. The month when terror lost its expiration date. When even the perpetrators began to realize that what they had built would soon be exposed to the world. The Red Army was advancing from the east at a speed that surprised even the German high command. Soviet troops were less than 90 miles from the camps in Upper Silesia, and in Auschwitz, on windless nights, guards could hear the distant thunder of artillery. In Birkenau, prisoners began to see columns of black smoke on the horizon, not from crematoria, but from burning documents. The German command knew it could not allow the world to see what it had created. It could not allow the Soviets to liberate witnesses. It could not leave gas chambers, ovens, warehouses of human hair, and mountains of children's shoes exposed. That was how the forced evacuation began, not as rescue, but as the destruction of evidence, the final act of a system that preferred to kill its victims rather than let them live to speak. Between January 17th and 21, more than 56,000 prisoners were driven out of Auschwitz, Birkenau, and their subcamps. Those who could not walk were executed in the barracks where they had slept. Those who stopped during the march were shot in the back of the head. Those left behind were abandoned without water, food, or medicine, expected to freeze to death before the Soviets arrived. They called them death marches, not as a metaphor, but as an exact description. The columns moved along frozen roads at -4 degrees Fahrenheit, without proper clothing or food, without a clear destination, under a single order. Move west, away from the Russians, away from witnesses, away from justice. They marched 12 miles a day, sometimes more. Those who fell were executed on the spot. Those who asked for water were beaten. Those who cried were silenced with rifle butts. Bodies were left in roadside ditches, frozen in the exact position of their death, like accidental monuments to systematic cruelty. In the middle of that organized chaos, on a military freight train stalled in Boython, a heavily industrial city that had been Polish until 1939 and would be again within months, 43 Jewish women were chained with forged steel. Not to transport them safely, but to prevent escape if the train was bombed. To ensure that if they died, they would die bound like animals. No one expected them to survive, and absolutely no one imagined that a German soldier would decide to change that. Leah Rosenfeld was 22 years old when she was deported from Kielce, Poland, in August 1942. She was the daughter of Isaac Rosenfeld, a tailor who made suits for rabbis, merchants, and teachers in the Jewish community. She grew up among silk threads, silver needles, and Yiddish conversations where the Talmud mixed with market gossip. Her father taught her to sew buttons before she learned to read. He used to say that buttons are what hold everything together, because without them, even the most expensive suit is just fabric falling apart. Leah made perfect buttonholes at 8, sewed sleeves at 10, and by 12 could copy any pattern after seeing it once. Her mother, Sarah Rosenfeld, sang her songs about Jerusalem, even though neither of them had ever left Poland, and she repeated that Jerusalem is not a place but a direction, the way the heart points when everything else fails. When the Kielce ghetto was established in March 1941, Leah kept sewing. Only now she did it for German uniforms, buttons on officers' coats, repairs on soldiers' trousers, working without ever looking into the eyes of the men who would wear them. She did it because every button sewn properly meant one more day alive, one more day in which her mother was still breathing and her father still allowed himself to believe they would survive. In August 1942, the ghetto was liquidated, and Leah Rosenfeld was separated from her parents during the selection. Her father tried to follow her, and a guard struck him with the butt of a rifle. Leah heard the bone break and never saw him again. Her mother was sent to Treblinka, something Leah learned later, when a woman who had worked sorting clothing whispered to her, "Your mother was wearing a blue dress. I recognized it. It was in the Treblinka pile." And then came Auschwitz, and Leia stopped sewing. Instead, she learned how to become invisible, to walk without noise or dust, to take up no space, to breathe without letting her breath show in the frozen air, to exist without being seen, counted, or remembered. Understanding that survival there had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with becoming so small it wasn't worth killing you. But in January 1945, invisibility was no longer enough, because the camp was being evacuated, and during evacuations everyone was visible, everyone was counted, and everyone became a potential witness who had to disappear. The selected prisoners were handcuffed in groups of 5 for no technical reason. It didn't make transport easier or prevent real escapes. It was cruelty turned into protocol, a guarantee that if one fell, the others would be dragged down too, and that until the very end, they would know they were not individuals, but parts of a machine built for suffering. Leia was chained beside Ava Silber, a 31-year-old translator who had worked in Berlin before the war, translating commercial correspondence from German into French and English. Arrested in 1943 not for practicing her faith, she hardly ever entered a synagogue, but because her last name was proof enough in the Reich. Next to Ava was Miriam Katz, a 19-year-old deported from Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, once the intellectual capital of Eastern European Jewry. She had been separated from her family at 17 and didn't know whether her parents or siblings were still alive. She only knew she had been alone for 2 years, and that their loneliness hurt more than hunger. The fourth in the chain was Hannah Weiss, a 37-year-old midwife who had helped more than 100 children into the world before being arrested in Krakow in 1942, and who in the camp tried to keep practicing in secret. Holding babies she knew would be killed immediately, singing to them and giving them the only minutes of tenderness they would ever know before handing them over, fully aware of what would come next. The fifth was Rosa Grun, a 28-year-old woman from Womra who had not spoken for months. She had watched her 3 children die during a selection in 1943, and from that moment chose silence. Not because she couldn't speak, but because in a world where a raised hand could kill your children, words had lost their meaning. 5 women, 1 chain, no hope, only the certainty that whatever came next would be worse than everything before. The train was supposed to leave at dawn on January 27th, but Soviet bombing the night before had destroyed the tracks 15 kilometers from Boythen, and the convoy was left standing, waiting for orders, repairs, or for the cold to finish the work the bullets had not. It was in that waiting, in that silence where time seemed suspended, that a German soldier made the mistake of looking a Jewish prisoner in the eyes and saw something he wasn't supposed to see. A person. Otto Keller was not a hero, nor a member of the resistance, nor a covert saboteur, nor even a man of strong convictions. He was a 34-year-old non-commissioned officer, a former bricklayer from Nuremberg who had built houses before the war rebuilt him, drafted in 1943 after a back injury, a fractured vertebra from lifting stones for a fortification, that kept him off the Eastern Front and fit only for administrative duties, supervising transports, checking documents, making sure orders were carried out without questions. Otto didn't ask questions. He had learned that doing so was dangerous. He had seen men sent to punishment units or simply disappear after expressing doubts. So he signed, counted, checked lists, and avoided looking too closely at what those lists meant, until that dawn in freight car number 7, where he found 43 women chained in rows of 5, some shaking uncontrollably, others already unable to move, their muscles frozen into impossible positions. One of them was Rosa, though Otto didn't know her name. Her wrist was so swollen that the chain had disappeared beneath inflamed skin, flesh growing around the metal as if the body were trying to absorb the instrument of its own torture. Otto looked at the document he had received that morning, written in the bureaucratic language that turned genocide into management. Prisoners, Category 3. Transport to Ravensbrück. Do not feed. Do not provide blankets. Do not remove handcuffs until final destination. Category 3 meant disposable, deaths that required no precise record, trains that could arrive with fewer bodies without anyone asking questions. Final destination meant it didn't matter whether they arrived alive. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, then looked around. Feldwebel Friedrich Weber was inspecting another car 30 meters away. The other guards were smoking near the locomotive more than 50 meters off, fighting the freezing wind. No one was watching. Otto took the bolt cutters from his belt, a tool designed for barbed wire, capable of snapping 8mm steel chains, and said quietly but firmly, with the tone of an unquestionable order, "Cut them." Karl Neumann, a 22-year-old soldier who had been assigned to his unit barely 2 weeks earlier, stared at him without understanding, eyes and mouth open until he managed to say, "Sir, the orders say I must ensure safe transport." "They don't say I have to ensure torture," Otto replied. "The cuffs are a medical risk. If they die of gangrene before reaching Ravensbrück, it becomes an administrative problem." It was a weak justification, and they both knew it. But in the army, a justification was enough. Karl hesitated for 3 eternal seconds, then nodded, took out his own tool, and began to cut. The first metallic click shattered the silence of the car, and with it something else, something invisible but real, something none of those women had ever expected to feel again, as Leah sensed the chain loosen before falling, the cold metal sliding over her wounded skin, leaving behind a damp trail of dried blood mixed with pus. Leah slowly raised her hands, cautiously, as if she could not quite believe they still obeyed her, as if she feared the movement was an illusion, and that if she blinked, she would discover her hands had been amputated, and what she felt was only the phantom echo of something already lost. Her wrists were marked by deep grooves, dark red, almost black where the skin had begun to necrotize, but they were still there, whole, hers. Beside her, Miriam Katz sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with every breath, producing sounds that were not entirely human, sounds from a place that existed before language. Eva Silber wrapped her arms around her, pressing her against her chest with a strength she did not know she still had, a pressure that hurt and yet somehow healed. Hannah Weiss stared at her own free hands, as if they belonged to someone else, as if they had been exchanged while she slept. And Rosa Grün, the woman who did not speak, who had lived for months locked inside a silence deeper than death, let out a sound. It was not a word and not a cry, but something more primitive, something that had been trapped in her throat for so long she had forgotten it could still come out. Otto Keller did not hold anyone's gaze and said nothing more. He simply kept cutting, chain after chain, woman after woman, the metal surrendering with each sharp snap, the handcuffs hitting the wooden floor with a light clink 43 times. 43 times he chose to let an order mean something different from what he had been taught. When he finished, he gathered the handcuffs from the floor and tossed them into a metal bucket used for tools. The clash of metal echoed through the rail car like a bell. Then he looked at Karl Neumann, pale, trembling not from the cold, but from fear, and told him that if anyone asked, he was to say the chains were defective, that the rust was excessive and posed a risk during transport, and that if that was not believed, He should say Otto himself had given the order and would take full responsibility. Karl nodded, knowing, as Otto did, that this was not a defense but a preemptive confession, a signed sentence if anyone chose to investigate. No one did. In January 1945, the Reich was collapsing far too quickly to stop over 43 pairs of handcuffs. The train departed 2 hours later, once repair crews welded the damaged tracks. The women traveled without chains, but also without water, without blankets, without food, and without any certainty that their destination would be anything other than a mass grave in the forest. The journey to Ravensbrück took 3 days, when it normally would have taken one, because the tracks were damaged in multiple places and Allied bombings forced the convoy to stop, hide in tunnels, and wait for the planes to pass. Leah sat on the floor of the railcar with her hands resting in her lap, feeling them as strange and light, as if they had belonged to someone else and had been returned to her after years of absence. She slowly moved her fingers, watching, almost mesmerized, as they still responded to her will, as she could still command her own body. Eva came closer and touched her shoulder, whispering why he had done it. Leah did not answer right away, because there was no clear answer, or there were too many, or perhaps the answer mattered less than the act itself. "I don't know," she finally said. "But he did." Eva nodded, then added softly, almost to herself, that her grandmother used to say the world rests on 36 righteous people. People who, in every generation, do the right thing when no one is watching. And that if those 36 disappeared, the world would collapse. She wondered whether he was one of them as she looked toward the closed door of the railcar where the soldier had stood. Leah slowly shook her head. "I don't know. But right then, we didn't need 36. We only needed one." During the 3-day journey, 4 women died, not from torture or execution, but from cold, hunger, and infections their bodies could no longer fight. They died with their hands free. And for the other 39, that meant something they could not explain, but felt with deep, unmistakable clarity. It meant that, in their final moments, they had been treated as people rather than as livestock. The first to die was a 42-year-old woman named Rivka Adler from Łódź. She died during the first night, held by the arms of 2 women she did not know, who embraced her until she stopped trembling. Her last words were "thank you," not in German, but in Yiddish, a dank. Gratitude for hands that could still hold, for arms without chains, for dying touched with tenderness rather than violence. The second was an 18-year-old girl named Noah Bernstein, deported from Hungary. She died on the second day from a fever that had been building for weeks and spent hours delirious, speaking to her mother in Hungarian, convinced she was at home, certain it had all been a nightmare. The women did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. And when she closed her eyes, Hanna Weiss sang her a lullaby in Polish, because mothers sing the same melodies regardless of language. The third and fourth died together during the second night from hypothermia. They were sisters, Rahel and Esther Lowy from Vienna, 29 and 26 years old. They had been arrested together, deported together, survived together, and died together, holding each other, sharing the last warmth they had left. By morning, their bodies were so entwined, it was hard to separate them. Hanna Weiss, who had seen too many births and too many deaths, closed the eyes of all 4 and recited the Shema in a barely audible voice, and the others answered, "Amen," even those who no longer believed in any God who could allow such things. After that, Hannah devoted herself to keeping the younger women warm, rubbing their arms with movements learned in difficult births, sharing her own body heat as she had done her entire life, even knowing the cost. At night, Miriam Katz curled up against Ava Silber, and Ava, the translator who had spent years carrying words between languages, now turned her body into a shelter, singing lullabies in German, remnants of a world where children could sleep safely. Rosa Grün, the woman who did not speak, began gently touching the other women's wrists, checking again and again that the chains were really gone, making sure it was not a dream. Each time, her eyes filled with tears that did not fall, freezing on her lashes like tiny crystals. They began to call her the one who remembers with her hands, because although Rosa did not speak, her fingers said everything that mattered. She touched, verified, confirmed, and in that repeated gesture lived their shared fear that kindness might be temporary, that the chains could return. Leah Rosenfeld spent much of the journey looking at her own hands, watching how the light slipping through the cracks cast shadows across her fingers, moving them slowly as if playing an invisible piano. She thought of buttons, silk thread, her father's voice saying that quality lies in the details no one sees. She thought of him, beaten to death for trying to follow her, of her mother sent to Treblinka, of the blue dress that ended up in a pile of clothing. And she believed, perhaps, that they would have wanted her to remember that even in hell, someone can choose not to be part of the fire. On the afternoon of the second day, one of the women, a bookkeeper from Prague named Elisa Morgenstern, began teaching hand exercises, bending fingers, rotating wrists to keep circulation going, though everyone knew it was also a way to remind themselves that their hands still worked, that they were still theirs. And so, in that frozen rail car slowly moving toward Ravensbrück, 43 women, then 39, clung to an improbable truth. Someone had chosen not to harm them, and that smallest of choices proved that the world was not completely dark, that there were still cracks through which light could enter. The convoy reached Ravensbrück 3 days later, on January 30th, 1945. Of the 43 women who had left Beuthen, 39 survived the journey. 4 died of hypothermia before crossing the border, rigid on the floor of the railcar, their eyes open. Leah Rosenfeld was among the survivors. Upon arrival, she was registered as number 92847. Her head was shaved, the little clothing she had was taken away, and she was given a striped uniform far too large for her 36-kilogram body. But her hands, wounded and scarred, were still hers, and in that place, that already meant everything. The difference between being an object and being a person. Otto Keller was never discovered. No one reported the incident with the handcuffs. No one asked about the chains. No one investigated. And in the chaos of the war's final months, a small act of disobedience was lost among thousands of greater crimes. Records show that Otto was discharged in March 1945 due to the worsening of his back injury, and then he disappears from the archives, with no record of return or death, as if he had simply ceased to exist. Years later, in 1961, during a trial in Frankfurt, Feldwebel Friedrich Weber casually mentioned that he had seen a non-commissioned officer cut the handcuffs off a group of Jewish women prisoners in Beuthen in January 1945. He said it had been justified as a transport safety measure and that he never saw the man again after February. The court noted the testimony without being able to fully identify the soldier, only an incomplete surname in a file, only a gesture in the middle of the night, and 43 women who cried when they expected to die, and instead felt the metal fall from their wrists. Leah Rosenfeld survived Ravensbrück and was liberated on April 30, 1945, when the Red Army entered the camp. She weighed 37 kilos, had a fever of 40 degrees, infections in both wrists, tuberculosis, and dysentery. But she was still alive. She spent 4 months in a Soviet military hospital, and doctors doubted she would make it. Yet Leah clung to life with the same stubbornness her father had once shown sewing buttons, with precision, patience, and the quiet conviction that every stitch mattered. She emigrated to Israel in 1948 on one of the first ships after the Declaration of Independence, and married Abraham Levin, a Dachau survivor who had lost his entire family, but still believed it was worth building a new one. They had 2 children, a son named Moshe after Leah's father, and a daughter named Sarah after her mother. Leah never sewed again, never touched a needle. She never wore bracelets, watches, or anything that circled her wrists. She never spoke German again, though she understood it perfectly. For years she remained silent about the camps, until 1973, when Yad Vashem began collecting testimonies, and her son convinced her to participate. "Mom, if you don't tell it, who will?" In a 3-hour interview, she spoke about Kielce, the ghetto, Auschwitz, the march, and the train. At the end, she mentioned the soldier from Beuthen. She did not remember his name or his face clearly. Everything was blurred, gray figures in a gray world. But she did remember his calm, steady voice, as if cutting the shackles off Jewish women were the most normal thing in the world, as if humanity were not rebellion, but simply what was right. The interviewer asked whether she thought he understood the risk, whether it had been a conscious act of resistance or a spontaneous impulse. Leah answered that she did not know and would never know, but she knew what he did, and that was enough. Because in that place and at that moment, when they were expecting mutilation and had accepted pain as inevitable, someone decided it did not have to be so. And that small, silent decision gave them back something they thought was lost forever. "What did it give you back?" he asked. Leah looked at her hands, the same hands that had sewn buttons in Kielce, trembled in Auschwitz, waited to be mutilated in Beuthen, and now held her grandchildren, and said it gave them proof that they were still human. Because if someone could choose not to be cruel, then they still mattered. They were still people worthy of that choice. Eva Silber also survived. She returned to Berlin in 1946 looking for traces of her former life, and found her apartment occupied by a German family who said they had bought it in 1944, and her office turned into a clothing shop. She found no one of her own and could not stay, because the city that had once been hers no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed the way she remembered it. She emigrated to Argentina in 1947, worked for 30 years as a translator for the United Nations, married an Italian architect, and had no children. Eva never spoke publicly about the train, never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs. But in a 1968 letter to her niece in New York, she mentioned the soldier from Beuthen. "I don't know if he was good. I don't know if he later regretted it, or if he ever thought about us. But that frozen dawn he chose to see us, to recognize us as people and not as things. And that saved us from something worse than death. Disappearing without being seen, from absolute invisibility." Eva Silber died in Buenos Aires in 1987 at the age of 73 and is buried in the Jewish cemetery of La Tablada. Miriam Katz died in Ravensbrück on April 14, 1945. 2 weeks before the liberation, barely 20 years old, Miriam Katz died in Ravensbrück. The official cause was typhoid fever. There was no autopsy, and her body ended up in a mass grave alongside hundreds of others. There is no photograph of her. No letters or diaries survived. Only her name in a registry and the memory of the women who were chained with her, who saw her cry when she believed her hands would be cut off, and who held her during the freezing nights on the train. Hannah Weiss survived and emigrated to Canada in 1949. She settled in Toronto and worked for 20 years as a nurse in a public hospital. But she never practiced again as a midwife. Because bringing life into the world, she once explained, requires believing in the world. And she could no longer believe in that way. She married a mathematics professor. They had 3 children, and Hannah died in 1989 at the age of 81, surrounded by her grandchildren. At her funeral, her daughter read a letter Hannah had written and never sent, addressed to the soldier who freed their hands. I will never know your name or be able to thank you, but I want you to know that every time I hugged my children, I thought of you. And every time I held my grandchildren, I remembered that I have these hands thanks to your decision. I don't know if that means anything to you, but to me it means everything. Rosa Gruen, the woman who stopped speaking after watching her children die, never regained her voice. She survived Ravensbrück, emigrated to Israel, and lived in a psychiatric institution in Tel Aviv, where for years doctors tried unsuccessfully to get her to communicate verbally again. But the nurses noticed something. Rosa spent hours gently touching her wrists, as if checking that something was still there. And sometimes, when other patients arrived with wrist injuries from suicide attempts, accidents, or self-harm, she would approach and touch them with the same care, as if saying what she could not put into words. Rosa Gruen died in 1952 at the age of 35. The official cause was cardiac arrest, although those who cared for her believed she had simply decided to stop living after enduring everything she could. She is buried in a cemetery in Tel Aviv with a headstone that bears only her name and dates, because what more can be said about a life so completely destroyed that not even words survived? The story of Leah Rosenfeld did not change the course of the war or stop the trains. It did not shut down gas chambers or save millions, but it transformed something smaller and essential. The way some women remembered their final days of captivity and what it meant to survive. Proof that even within the most brutal system ever designed, humanity could seep through. Because in the midst of absolute horror, someone decided that cruelty was not mandatory, that an order could be interpreted differently, and that humanity, even when dangerous and costly, was still possible. That decision, made in silence without witnesses or reward, demonstrated something no extermination system managed to erase completely. That goodness does not need to be heroic to be real, that compassion does not need to be public to exist, and that a small act at the right moment can break the certainty that everyone is cruel, the belief that no one will help, and the despair of thinking that suffering does not matter. Leah Rosenfeld died in 1994 in Haifa at the age of 71. She was buried next to her husband Abraham beneath an olive tree they planted in 1950, when they still believed they could build something beautiful on the ruins. On her headstone, her children engraved a phrase in Hebrew that recalls the day someone chose not to forget that they were human. There is no official record of the soldier's full name, no statue, no street, no plaque in Boython. Today Gliwice and once again Polish. But somewhere in Yad Vashem, among recorded testimonies being digitized, Leah's voice, with its Israeli accent and echoes of Polish Yiddish, continues to say that she does not know who he was or whether he was good or bad in general, does not know what he did before or after. But she knows what he did that night, when she stopped being a number and became a person with hands again. And in the darkness of that freight car in January 1945, in the clink of 43 pairs of handcuffs hitting the wooden floor, and in the crying of women who expected mutilation and instead felt the weight of the metal disappear, a certainty still echoes that no system managed to destroy. That even in hell, someone can choose not to be part of the fire, and that fragile certainty is sometimes enough to breathe one more day and remember that even in the darkest night, there was light. If you know someone from your city or country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero will be yours. And if this story moved you, consider supporting so that more stories like this can continue to reach those who need to hear them, because your support keeps alive the memory of those who were silenced.